Good morning with Tara Christie, CEO of Banyan Gold. The symbol is BYN on the TSX Venture. Good morning, Tara.
Good morning.
So Banyan has had a really transformational last year. I mean, actually, I think we could say a transformational last 8 months. I remember we were at the Rule Symposium in July in Florida, and you put out the updated resource and I wrote about it, and the share price was 27 cents or something like that. And then the second half of the year happened. And obviously a lot has to do with the sector, but also a lot has to do with your execution at the project level and the corporate level. So just tell us about what it feels like these last 6-7 months.
It feels like we're finally starting to get appreciated for what we have, but we're not all the way there yet. It's a big change. I look at my team and how excited everybody is about, everyone's excited that our share price is up, but we're more excited about what we have, what we're discovering, and what's ahead. And we're pretty grounded, we're pretty feet on the ground, have a really clear vision of where we need to go and how we're going to continue to revalue Banyan, because, we're still cheap compared to our peers and for what we have. And there were a bunch of things that were overhangs, and people are pretty well aware of them. That mineral resource that we talked about at the Rules Symposium was really important for sophisticated investors, institutions that really look at the geology. They really wanted to see a more lithologically constrained mineral resource. And I think people know there's been lots of projects with just inferred resources when later you find out, oh, the gold isn't there. So that was a huge catalyst because it brought credibility and people could see how this deposit hangs together, and the continuity of the high grade. The continuity of the gold is important, and the continuity of the high grade is also important. So that was a big catalyst. And then, of course, the next major catalyst was removing the overhang from getting 100% ownership of our property and knowing that we no longer had Victoria Gold as a shareholder. And that's taken a long time to clear up. Even in January, I was still talking with some of the data services, and we still see places where there's incorrect information on that. And so that's been part of us re-rating as well, because everyone thought that stock was going to be blown out, and of course it wasn't. And now, people are starting to understand with some of our drill results, and we still have over 60 holes to come from our deposit, that this high grade is coming together both at Airstrip and Powerline. And, it's going to drive us to a pretty exciting PEA here in the second half of 2026. So yeah, it feels good, but we're not resting on any laurels. I think I'm working harder than I ever have, but I get up in the morning and I'm pretty excited about it because I think we've got a great story to tell, and I'm pretty driven to add some value, particularly for my shareholders that have been there through the tough times and stuck with me, and there are some big ones who've done that.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, I think sometimes we need to take a step back and put things into perspective, and the perspective, I think, is that Banyan was really undervalued and really under the radar for quite an extended period of time. And it wasn't properly understood. I think it got a knock as being low grade. And then obviously 2024 happened with the accident there in the Yukon, and that just was like a double whammy. But now, fade the scene to February 2026, and not only do you have 7.7 million ounces, but you have you have a story that's emerging that there is higher grade, and there's quite a lot of it, and you keep as you drill more, especially with the funding that the company now has, you're finding a lot more of it. And I want to talk about some of these recent holes that you've drilled, but first let's talk about John Robbins and some of these new appointments to the company. John Robbins is quite a name in the industry, and so it seems like you're really upgrading the team.
Well, John's come on as an advisor, and he's also a very big shareholder. When he's bought in the market after doing 2 site visits last year, with the latest being our November 18th site visit, which we had to actually get a bigger plane. We had so many people that wanted to come on our November 8th site tour. Yeah, I worked with John Robbins when I was at Kamenak, and I was helping Ira, of course, on a few things. And that was a great success story. And, for me, he's been a mentor in the business. So for him to validate our project, to have come and been so excited about the geology, the new geological model, the exploration potential and prospectivity, and to say, hey, I'm going to let you use my name and I'm going to be part of, reviewing your technical information and helping you, with figuring out strategy. And that is a real validation to me, and I think for Banyan. And most people in this business, if they don't get in a deal early, they don't buy the stock. You wouldn't get an Eric Sprott not demanding a discount if he was to invest in a company. So for him to say, hey, I like this well enough, and I think it's valued fairly right now for me to make an investment, that's a real statement that I think people have underestimated in the market. And people also probably didn't notice that I exercised options early, so put in effectively another $200,000 into stock, because I think we're at the lows now, as did one of my directors and my CFO. So I think that's an part of the story. We're confident that this is a great price for Banyan.
And can you tell us about some other people that you've added to the team?
Sure. So on the ESG side, we added Allison Rippin Armstrong, who also worked with me at Kamenak. She's got a great understanding of the Yukon and First Nations and communities, and is helping us on that side, because that's super important. And it's great to have somebody that you've worked with before and you can connect with and can understand all the complexities that we're dealing with that, and help us communicate the story and the benefits to First Nations, particularly the National First Nation, and then also the community. So that's a great addition. On the geology side, we've added, with Duncan joining us in February, we've picked up a few of the other ex-Yamana teams, including Hannah Cowlin, who's, great field manager. And, we've already got our field team hired because we've already opened our camp, and we're going to have 4 drills turning here in March, maybe even a 5th drill, because we have some pretty exciting targets to hit. So yeah, at that side, because we drilled late, our last people were in our camp till December. We knew we could make them job offers for them to come back right away. So yeah, we're hitting the ground running with a really great, strong team.
Very good. Yeah, it's notable, the upgrading across the team and how you've built out the team. The VPX, Duncan, appears to be working very well. So let's talk about this Keno Hill style silver, because of course, I had visited the Yukon all the way back in 2018, and I went to the Keno Hill mine and learned about this silver camp, this great Yukon silver camp that has a long history and it's just incredibly high grades, and there's books about it. But it's been Banyan Gold since the early days. It's always been Banyan Gold. But you're right, you're basically adjacent to this great silver mine, and then all of a sudden you start hitting 5,600 grams per ton silver over 3.4 meters, and just there are a lot of big silver intercepts. And honestly, with the silver price at $75 or $80 an ounce, 100 gram per ton silver hit is actually really good. That's actually kind of high grade now. So tell us about the silver and what brought your attention back to it.
So, we'd hit a few holes over the course of, all our drill campaigns that had elevated silver, and we were always kind of watching it. But there wasn't enough of a pattern or a structural story. This last year, with Duncan coming on, as well as, having a different model to look at things and a structural understanding of these silver veins, he put a little time into focusing into it, and all of a sudden, we've hit these really elevated silver in a broad zone of fairly elevated silver 18 times. And then after this year's program, we've now hit 6 distinct veins, with our AG1 vein being the one where we can see that continuity. And we've actually established a 20-meter length of that very high grade, 13,000 grams over 2.29 meters within, 100 meters of 300 grams on one end, and then 20 meters away at about 65 meters depth. That 5,600 that you talked about over 3.4 meters, again, within a wider interval of, 100 grams or 300 grams. So, and then we've actually intersected within that same structural corridor that we believe over 1.5 kilometers to the north, another vein, which could be a related, part of the same kind of family of veins that might be going through there, or it could be the same vein. So, that is part of our story. And again, the majority of those veins were above 100 meters, some a little bit below. But if we can trace that up to the surface, and we do believe it potentially does come up much higher in the section, there is a little bit of overburden over it. So, you'd have to go and remove some of that. But, pretty exciting if you could find some silver at that grade that's open pit mineable that you could then, at that grade, yes, we could use the mill next door, that Hecla, have some kind of a toll mill arrangement or sale arrangement, because it is a similar type of ore. So, it looks just like theirs. We have to still do the metallurgy to confirm that, but that mill's set up for that type of recovery for silver. Or if, they're not, there's lots of places with that very, very high grade, you could truck that because it's pretty high value ore. So it gives us also some, earlier opportunities for revenue, as well as, another target. Overall, the story still is a very large gold deposit, and the value of that gold in place far exceeds what we have for the silver yet. But the potential for the silver to pay those early costs at a very low capital cost is really attractive.
So to be clear, these high-grade silver, intercepts that you drilled recently, this is part of like a vein swarm that's cutting through in between power line and airstrip?
So yeah, think about it. The gold mineralization is in place at about 100 million years. And then over time, you get these regional fractures, cracks, and faulting that you get these cracks formed. And then 20 million years later, the silver mineralization, which is generally kind of a later phase of these reduced intrusion type deposits, come and it fills those. So they're cracks actually cross-cutting the gold mineralization. So yeah, we do see kind of zones where we think there's probably sets of veins. And then this one larger vein, which looks like it's got some legs to it, because we found it at two different intersections with a fairly decent width at either end. So we have lots of targets to follow up on now. And now that our team has really tuned into it, we actually also hired a former Alexco Hecla geologist, Leanna Starrett now, who is certainly going to bring us a lot of expertise on the silver, because she spent a good part of her career studying it and looking at it. So that was another great addition to our team.
Okay, so let's talk about the Airstrip deposit, because you continue to demonstrate higher grades there. Tell us about the drilling that you've done recently and what the results are.
So that most recent Airstrip release, showed that we had a continuation of the Cal-1 high-grade mineralization down 350 meters vertically, but now giving us 750 meters of that unit up towards surface. That's pretty exciting. And the part of the reason why we drilled that hole is we're actually seeing in the mineral assemblage and the geochemistry it's indicating higher temperatures, so potentially vectoring towards the high temperature source. Or people say, where's the intrusion? That is one place where an intrusion or intrusions could be, is right underneath the Airstrip deposit. And this hole, ending in 15-gram material, that's nice high grade. Yeah, it's only 2.5 meters. But again, if you can find enough of that, that's a pretty interesting target. And do we have even higher grades as we continue to go deeper, or more of that grade? That's kind of what that was targeting, is our hypothesis that there could be an intrusion underneath Airstrip. And so far from, we haven't hit an intrusion yet, but we have seen that those minerals, as well as as the geochem that indicates we're closer.
So to be clear, at the Airstrip deposit, the host rock is calcareous, and so it soaks up the skarn.
It becomes a skarn effectively.
Okay,
so
it becomes a skarn. So
the
there's
mineralized fluids
intrusions.
come into this calcareous unit and they transform it into it's a reaction and turns into a skarn.
I see. So there's an intrusion somewhere that's pumping fluids into the calcareous rocks.
Some or intrusions. This is a big 5-kilometer system. The original Craig Hart model actually said that the surface expression above an intrusion is only 1 kilometer. That's it's a fairly narrow range, but so this could be a very big, long-lived system. And also seeing the silver next door, if that's the late phase of this system, that also was pretty indicative that this could have been a very big system. They've produced over 200 million ounces of silver, and 200 more in their resource reserve. That's a pretty big system. So, I think getting to understand that, and we've done a lot of work in the last year, technical work on looking from our geophysics and even use some AI along with our geochem and understanding the variations in certain elements within that, which help you vector into where your intrusive source might be.
So there could be multiple intrusions, but you still haven't found one yet.
Well, we found that dike, that felsic dike, that that's effectively intrusive, but no, we haven't found one. But remember, we haven't been drilling deep. The majority of our deposit is now within, deepest part's 250 meters, but the bulk of it 200. There were lots of places where originally when we drilled, we only drilled 100 meters deep because we were, doing early exploration, and you weren't paying for deep holes until you understood the geology. So, there's lots of potential for us to add ounces at depth. And even remember, our resource was done at a 2050 gold price. I know people are using 28 to 32 is kind of the highest that I've seen lately. That alone is going to drive our pit lower. I mean, we haven't drilled deep enough for some of these high grade zones that we see at the bottom. And if you look on our website, there's a cross section of our airstrip deposit or in the video where you see this really high grade zone that then you go down to that intersection we just made. Well, all of that is below the pit at a 2050 gold price, just as an example. And I expect that at a higher gold price, a $3,000 gold price, that whole higher grade zone is going to get pulled in, along with a bunch of other areas. Changing your gold price in your model brings in ounces that were always there, but they didn't make the cutoff, right? But we're going to add ounces not only from increasing our gold price, but our drill program this year, will add ounces. It wasn't focused on adding ounces. It was focused on defining the high grade and really demonstrating it in particularly the areas in the first 1 to 3 years of what will be the PEA mine plan, and then specifically other areas that we could see where converting waste to ore, adding high grades, pushing the pit lower would improve the economics. And we think they're going to be pretty exciting because having the benefit of having done a lot of work towards our PEA before we executed our drill program last year, we really were able to focus the drill program on that.
I seem to recall that the area right in between Powerline and Airstrip, there's a theory that you've had for a while that it joins at depth, but I don't think you've ever tested it deep enough to confirm that theory. I mean, is that a thought? Is that something that...
Well, that deep hole did confirm that because it drilled through Powerline and then intersected Airstrip at 350.
Which hole was that? Oh, the 350 meter hole.
The 350 meter hole in the last news release.
Okay, so it's not even that.
And then we do have I think 3 or 4 fences of holes that cross the gap between that 400 meters between Airstrip and Powerline. And yeah, it looks like there's even another high grade zone through there in those holes. But and they probably abut because there could be a fault through there rather than directly connect, which is kind of a technical detail. But yes, we could fill that 400 meter gap between the two if we wanted to allocate the drill budget to that. And last year we thought we had better targets than that because people could see that connection without us actually having to drill off that connection. This year we're got some really good targets for the first phase of our program, following up on some of the high grade, focusing on things that you need to drill when the ground's frozen, because there's lots of areas that are kind of swampy and where you don't want to build unnecessary roads. You want to make sure you're doing as little environmental damage. And that's why we might ramp up to 5 drills during this season when we can get drilling done and not have to be creating more grid roads. So yeah, that's going to be pretty fun. And then as we get the last of our results, we can refine our drill program. And that's something that our team now, we have the internal capacity to effectively be modeling internally real time. We're getting the data from each hole daily, and that's influencing even before it's logged. We do a quick log. We kind of understand whether it's meeting our thoughts for what we wanted to see in that hole, because you can see, particularly in power line, these sheeted veins, discordant sheeted veins and visible gold regularly. So that really helps guide our program. And so we're pretty dynamic in the field in deciding where we're going. And that's part of the secret of our success. There's no blind, here's the plan, we're just drilling it off. There's a lot of thought that goes into every drill hole.
So tell us about some of the targets for 2026. I know in the past we've talked about some regional targets. I know you did like a VTEM survey and you were going to work up some regional targets. Is the focus just let's stay at Airstrip and power line, let's chase these silver veins a little more and see if they're coming up to surface, or are you actually going to do some wildcatting and some step outs?
Well, there's some holes that our targets have identified that we need to drill, because if they could be game changers for us. So between probably about 15%, maybe even a little bit higher of our total drill budget will go to either big step outs at AurMac or on our Nitra property, where we have a 720 square kilometers. And yeah, that AI and our geologists identified some really strong targets. And if you look at this, where we are, we're basically a belt that goes from us all the way across the river there to Sitka, and they've got some very high grade. Victoria's just to the north. These types of deposits, these intrusions, generally occur in belts, and that's why you could have multiple intrusions or a large intrusion that has multiple splays that kind of come up. So yeah, we're still on that discovery upside because we've only explored about 2% of our total land package, and we just acquired quite a bit of new ground last year, both from staking early in the year and then acquiring by purchasing ground, because we think our modeling has given us the potential for there to be a lot more. And people say, well, how much more do you need? Well, I did have one corporate tell me, well, Tara, 10 million in a resource isn't too much. But again, I think the exploration story is if we can find some more of that higher grade that's proximal and show that this property has a lot more upside than even around AurMac, which has a lot of upside. If you listen to Quentin Henning and those that have looked at the geology, it seems like there's a lot of potential on the property, and we want to have the opportunity to get some value for that for our shareholders.
I think you're well on the way to getting some value for that for your shareholders. Yeah, and that's a topic I want to talk about towards the end of the conversation. But I'm gonna pry a little more here. Can you describe your favorite wildcat target? Can you tell us what one of these new targets is based on and why it's exciting?
Well, the geophysical results lining up with some really strong soil anomalies and historic and current placer mining right above it. That's a good target. That's 3 pretty strong vectors. And remember, the Nitra area probably has 11 to 12 active placer mining licenses on it. And that's one of the main indicators of there being gold. It had to come from somewhere. It's not topographically probably related to AurMac. Maybe Duncan Creek and others could be related to AurMac, and there's been lots of placer gold there. But that's partly what makes it exciting. I actually wanted to mobilize a drill last fall, but it was hard to get fly drills and mobilize in the late fall, and we wanted to make sure we were operating safely. So these targets have been waiting since October of last year, and we have some new ones that we developed over the winter. So that's the fun of exploration, and I grew up in exploration. So this time of year, you go to these conferences, you start talking about mobilizing into the field, everyone's excited, and now it's time to get out there and prove it with the drill bit.
Very good. So you're about to mobilize the rigs. You said 4 drill rigs, possibly a 5th. So how many meters in 2026? And can you give us a rough timeline of how you think the year will unfold?
So yeah, we're planning at least 40,000 meters on AurMac. We're leaving a little bit of money in the kitty, so we will be able to upsize with existing budget, and then 5,000 purely at Nitra. Some of that 4,000 may be allocated to these exploration holes as well. But starting off early, the drills are already on site, our camp's already open. So I think we have some more parts and parts of drills still to be mobilized to site, but we're well underway. And because we're not fly-in, we're road accessible. We had a camp, we had drills turning last year. The only reason drills left, we had 3 drills at the end of the season, was for maintenance. Truck them back to Whitehorse so that they can be tuned up and really be ready for this year. And that's an advantage for us. If you have to leave your drill in a fly-in camp, and then your first month is spent doing that maintenance that we could have done over the winter, that's a huge advantage. So we're expecting early productivity. We've got great drill teams that know our property coming back. So that's, I think you'll see fairly early results. We've talked to the labs. We'll be one of the first ones getting samples into the lab so that we can, start getting results back pretty quickly. I think the labs better staff up. They're going to be busy.
Yeah, seriously. So you're still waiting on assays from 2025. You still have a bunch of holes in the lab.
Yeah, they're coming. It's there was a bit of a break over Christmas for the lab, and they did some of their own upgrading. And it's not just you need the assay results from the lab. Sometimes you need to, like if you have high grade results, sometimes you need over limits. You need to check your QA QC before you, which is your quality control, to make sure that there's nothing that's, so it's not like you just get them from the lab and you announce them the next day. And then we also like to make sure we can tell a story with each news release so that, we're not just putting out random results and saying, here, interpret this yourself. And put a whole bunch of different things in a news release, and it's confusing for shareholders and the retail market. The analysts who model it themselves might get it. So we put quite a bit of time into trying to actually communicate what we're seeing and what it means for the deposit and for our strategy going forward.
Very good. Yeah, I think Banyan is far past the point of putting out 1 or 2 drill holes at a time. I think you want to tell a story, you want to batch 8, 9, 10 holes together in a news release, and I think investors appreciate that, like having it make sense. I want to talk about the Yukon more broadly in terms of, a lot has happened in the last year. A lot has happened. We know that companies like Hecla and Agnico have investments in the Yukon, but there's plenty of mining companies that do not. I'm just curious if you're hearing about any companies that are interested in investing in the Yukon, maybe acquiring some assets and getting going, and what are the companies that are there already doing?
Well, I think, there's been a lot of strong interest, and I'll know more after I'm heading off to the BMO conference where some of those corporates will be. We did see quite a few corporates come into the Yukon and kicking the rocks of various companies. And I think we'll see some more of that this year. And it's really that, corporates all pay attention to all the big stories. When you've got a big deposit, they have to, if somebody in their upper management or C-suite asks, the geologists need to know a little bit about that deposit. So generally they keep up on all kinds of projects around the world, just as a part of their practice in case they don't want to look dumb if they get asked, right? So we're seeing more interest generally. Hecla, they've put a lot of money into their development at Keno Hill. After purchasing it from Alexco, it was undercapitalized. So that's been a very, they've been pretty focused on that, and Hecla's share price is doing great. That's been turning a profit for the last couple of years. We've seen positive developments like Selkirk purchasing an interest in the Minto copper mine. That's pretty positive. Forte, coming in and with Agnico as well. So Agnico's in the area. Snowline's been doing a great job generating lots of attention worldwide as people talk about that deposit, and I think people will start seeing some of the similarities with our deposit too, particularly as we can start to show these higher grades in a near surface deposit that has roads access and already has hydropower lines crossing it. So I think you'll hear that narrative that they're both great projects and deserve to move ahead.
Very good. The front of the presentation says 5 million ounces of 1 gram per ton gold. I think that's an amazing goal. I remember when my goal for Banyan was 3 million ounces of 1 gram per ton. You basically achieved that by now. So by when will we achieve the 5 million ounces of 1 gram per ton goal? And what do you need to do?
So the goal for that was our targeting with last year's drilling, right? And that was really all about, that's what we think will really drive some compelling economics for this project. And then remember, when you look at the 0.55 cutoff, the two categories, there's almost 4.55 million ounces of 1 gram already in the old resource. So that was our goal for this resource update, that people will be able to see that within the deposit, and our target is for that to be within what goes into the PEA. So that, we'll have that in the resource update here in the second quarter, and then followed by our PEA in the second half of 2026.
Oh, okay. So it's already achieved.
Well, we'll see. The truth is in the drill results, right? And then also in the resource update. That was, that if we can see that within a mine plan, it certainly changes what people perceive about Banyan. And 2024 or 2025 was all about the end of it, changing perceptions of Banyan. And I think people still need to look again, even at this gold price though, what is low grade? Is 0.6 still considered low grade for an open pit near surface deposit? That was at $1,800 gold. Are people's paradigms going to change with the higher gold price? At a $3,000 gold price, should that be 0.5, 0.4? What grade's too low grade? And then once you've built the mill, does it matter what grade? You look at how successful Fort Knox has been. Once the capital costs of their infrastructure was paid off, that's been very, very lucrative for Kinross. So I think that will tell the story is, what is the capital cost? What's the payback? And then how long does this mine run? Large deposits like this, when you get something that's, let's say 10 or 15 million ounces, and you start a mill and it's based on having, 5, 8 million ounces total mineable. But once that's mined and the capital's paid off, the rest of that deposit becomes, just, operating costs, because you've paid back the capital. Yeah, you may need to keep investing capital. You look at like Marigold, they're mining down a kilometer. We haven't even drilled a hole that's a kilometer. Never mind thought about mining. Does this deposit go that deep? How long will it run if it becomes a mine? Those are key questions, and those are what the big corporates are looking, because they want to make generational investments where they're building something, and because you're investing in community, you're really building up your reputation in that area. Having something that will run longer than a 10-year mine life is actually pretty important to them. And I think that's why we're seeing this trend to 5 million ounces kind of being the low end of what a tier 1 standard is, and that's what's really going to help propel some of the majors.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as you said that it's 0.6 still low grade, I immediately thought about Fort Knox, and I believe their head grade is about 0.3 grams per ton gold, and that's a very profitable mining operation that's spitting out a lot of free cash flow. So the answer is no. 0.6 grams per ton, if it's good metallurgy and it's open pitable, and the strip ratio isn't too high, that's not low grade at all. That's very good grade, actually. And so, yeah, I think things have changed. The perception of Banyan is changing quite a bit. not only due to the gold price environment, but also due to the fact that you're hitting higher grades more consistently, and you're continuing to stretch the edges, of the ore bodies here at AurMac. I do want to ask you about share price targets, because like CoreMark has like a $3.50 price target. There's some other analysts that have $2 price targets. 350 seems very ambitious. I'm not saying it's not possible. It's definitely possible. But what do you need to do to achieve that kind of valuation, Tara?
Well, on a per ounce basis, when you look at what, say, CoreMark put their net NAV at, that still put us at a 0.16 NAV, so 0.18. Even if you looked at all of them, so that's not expensive when you think about what the total value of gold in this project might be. And our PA is going to tell you what that is. So all of them are a little bit thinking ahead. What's the PEA going to say? And I think, if anything, they're trying to be conservative in some of their estimates. Yeah, they've used higher gold prices. And you need to also look at the dates of those targets. So the paradigm target was in August, before Beaver Creek. And what was gold price in August? It was right as we went into that. And so we've seen a lot of changes since then. Canaccord was December. And again, there's been quite a bit of change since December. Things are moving so fast. People ask me, what gold price are you going to use in your updated resource in your PA? And I'm like, I don't know. It is so dynamic out there. You look at how much the 3-year trailing average just changes within a month. Because of these high gold prices, it becomes significant. So we'll tell people when we get there. But yeah, in terms of price targets, that it has changed. Even my own internal price target changes and has gone up, because I really think that we've shown that there's real value here. So I won't say a price target, but I do talk pretty regularly to my largest shareholders about what they think and how aligned they are with the analysts, because I think that gives me a good, and keeps you grounded, because your shareholders remind you about what makes projects successful. So yeah, in terms of price, I love the $350 price target. I think it's based on some good modeling. So, people should do their own due diligence and read the reports to decide whether or not they think of the valuation.
Yeah, when you start thinking about the potential for 10 million ounces of mineable ounces, and you start thinking about the possibility of a 20-year mine life and annual output of between 300 and 500,000 ounces a year, well, then you can definitely start to wrap your head around the $3 or $4 price target, because with those metrics, it might be worth even more than that, right? So it all depends upon what a pre-feasibility study or feasibility study will look like. And like you said, the mine life and the daily throughput at the mill. And obviously, are we talking about 150,000 ounces a year, or are we talking about 300,000 ounces per year, right? So if you can get up into that 300,000 ounce per year threshold, the valuation can get very high.
Yep, I agree. And big deposits can do that. You can get 300,000-400,000 ounces per year. And there aren't very many of them that are in, first world jurisdictions that have reasonable permitting timelines, particularly with infrastructure. I looked at the success of Snowline's share price, and, it gives me a good model of look at their valuation. They've done great. And, gives me a goal, like, okay, look what really drove their valuation. Their PA was a pretty big milestone for them. It really, their share price took off after that. And then they've continued to. So, and generally, if there's some other research pieces that show that share prices generally appreciate as you move towards your PA.
I'm going to ask you a slightly personal question, because I have to make my interview stand out. Something we've talked about a lot over the years since I first met you is how much skin you have in the game and how you continue to put money into the company. I don't know what your updated shareholding is. I think it's over 10 million shares, but I'm not positive. You have a significant stake in Banyan. You've always had a large stake in Banyan. You've ate your own cooking for 10 years. Tell us about what your shareholdings are. And now that it's worth a substantial, I don't know what it's worth, but I know it's worth a lot. Does it make you nervous at all?
You always have to be nervous as a CEO. It's my job to worry about what the risks are and really make sure I'm actively managing them. So I have 3.5%, which means, yeah, I worry about it and think about it every day. But more positively, I'm planning on how I move things forward and how I keep the forward momentum, because I'm pretty vested in it. And, you know, I'd love personally to see this become a mine one day, whether or not I'm at the helm of it or not at that time. I really would like to make sure that my shareholders are looked after, and that's what drives me for sure. That, you know, this, we want to do it right. You want to have benefits for the community, but to see it become a mine would be, yeah, personal success. So how do I set it up for that? How do I set it up to maximize value for my shareholders? And, you know, that recent option, that was another 200,000 in cash I had to lay out in that. So that puts me over 2.7 million in cash into Banyan at this point.
So you exercised options early, and don't you have to pay like some taxes on that or something?
Yeah, it's painful. Welcome to Canada.
So you put money into the company, you didn't sell anything to take money out, and you still have to pay a tax bill.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. I don't know. I honestly don't know many CEOs. I can't think of many CEOs who have done that. There might have been one or two that I can, if I think really hard, but I know that generally when executives do option exercises, they sell a portion of the shares to pay the tax bill and the cost of the option exercise. And I think that's quite reasonable. I would probably do that. But wow, okay, so you're committed. You're really committed. You're really,
well, look at my SETI history. I've done that every time. I've never sold a share. That's right. I paid the taxes up front. And if you look, I had a director and my CFO that did the same thing. So I think we're showing as a management team, we've got real belief in where we're going, real skin in the game. We're pretty driven to you know, make Banyan succeed.
okay, so I think you're over 13 million shares now.
Yeah, something like that. I don't think about it daily because it's really not what the value of that isn't what drives me. It's you know, 3.5%. So
Okay,
I think it's just under 10 actually, and no, 13. Yeah, sorry, I should go look it up.
yeah, I think it's about 13, but yeah, it doesn't really matter. I was just curious. So look, I think you've set the stage really well here. I started out the conversation by basically saying, hey, you know, you've had an incredible year at Banyan. Have you taken it all in? And you basically said, we're just getting going here. And I actually think that, you know, the biggest opportunity is still ahead. So look, I'll give you the final word, Tara, and maybe you can just go through the company finances, how much cash do you have in the treasury, and then some key goals for 2026, and I'll give you the last word.
Great, thank you very much. Well, we always go on our last financials. So, you know, we started this year with $38 million, which is a lot of money for us. That's enabled us, and because we raised it early, we've been planning for this year's exploration program all through the winter and through the fall. You know, lots of times you have to worry about financing. That means that we've been really focused on that. So we've planned 40,000 meters plus on AurMac, with a resource update here in the second quarter. Once we get our results back and they're all QA/QC'd, we'll go ahead with that resource update. And then we're planning for our PEA in the second half of 2026. And then we'll have all the drill results from this year, again, targeting some really high value targets in some of these higher grade zones, some extensions, and as I said, some blue sky drill targets that we want to drill. And we're going to put at least 5,000 meters into that, maybe more. So yeah, look for lots of news flow for us as we, you know, go through 2026. And I'm pretty excited with my team. You know, I think I've got the right people at the right time in the right place. We've got all cylinders burning, ready to really advance AurMac in 2026.
Sounds good. Thank you, Tara. Christie. Cheers.
Thanks, Robert.